focusing on some different aspects of what is said by him and others about him. So section 4, a different Socrates. Kierkegaard's dramatically opposed visions of human existence, one the Greek and the other the Christian, leave a wide gap through the center of which I would like to find a middle way. That's something I learned from Bert too. Always find the way in the middle, he said. Find the two extreme versions like Merleau-Ponty did when he found empiricism and intellectualism, and find what each has right and what they have to reject. I think that we can see this via media if we read the phenomenon of Socrates differently than Kierkegaard has. When we do, we will see that Socrates' account of who we are and of what it is for us to teach and learn together bears a much greater resemblance to Heidegger's phenomenology and Bert's pedagogy than Kierkegaard could conceive. In developing the claim that Socrates is only accidentally involved in bringing his students into being, Kierkegaard emphasizes Socrates' description of himself as a midwife. Mieusis is the word, the process. By contrast with this description, however, I believe that the phenomenology of genuine teaching, or of Socrates as a teacher, is hidden within the etymology of a different word that's used to describe Socrates, gadfly. Now, as everyone knows, gadfly is the word that Socrates uses to describe himself in his role of going around the city of Athens, arousing or awakening the people. But I want to give a peculiar reading of what that means. The Greek word for gadfly is muops. It's got the ops in it, like Cyclops has. I'll explain that in a moment. And we shall look at this word more closely in a moment. But when Socrates refers to himself as a gadfly, a muops, in the famous passage from the Apology at 30e, here's what he says, and this is passage 10 on your handout. And so, men of Athens, I am now making my defense, not for my own sake, as one might imagine, but far more for yours, that you may not, by condemning me, err in your treatment of the gift the god gave you. For if you put me to death, you will not easily find another who, to use a rather absurd figure, attaches himself to the city as a gadfly to a horse, which, though large and well-bred, is sluggish on account of his size and needs to be aroused by stinging. I think the urging and reproaching each one of you. I think the god fastened me upon the city in some such capacity, and I go about arousing and urging and reproaching each one of you, constantly lighting upon you everywhere the whole day long. Now, there are three things that I want to highlight about this passage before we get to the word muops itself. First, Socrates is presenting himself as a kind of divine gift to the city. He is, he says, a gift the god gave you. The gift, the Greek word is dosis, from a god, is something sacred in traditional Homeric Greek culture. Something that happens in your favor without your having done anything to deserve it. Something, in fact, that you could not have brought about by yourself through an act of the will. And something that, therefore, demands your gratitude and care. So far from Socrates' presence being accidental and irrelevant to his students, at least in his, Plato's, presentation of it, it is, in fact, a way the gods have of caring for the students. And far from its being an illusion, therefore, that they should love or be grateful for the gift of Socrates, this is, in fact, what is demanded of them. On the other hand, this gift is not uniquely embodied in Socrates, the way Jesus is the unique embodiment of God, although it may not happen soon, according to Socrates. The gods just might well give another such gift if we wait long enough. The notion of a gift in pre-Socratic Greek culture is a rich one. Bert and I have explored it together in other contexts. So I won't go into it too much detail here, but I will emphasize that the idea that a person, a Socrates or a Bert, for instance, could be a gift for those whom he visits is a fundamental feature of the Homeric Greek world. Indeed, perhaps the most important type of divine gift that one can receive comes in the form of a stranger or a beggar, someone not quite of the people, who shows up unexpectedly. We know this must be central for the Greeks because, as Bert has often pointed out, Zeus himself is the god of strangers. He's the one who protects strangers. To treat a stranger poorly, as the Cyclops Polyphemus does when Odysseus and his men visit him, is to incur the fateful wrath of Zeus. That's, I think, the backstory behind why Socrates says that condemning him would be a tragic error. By contrast with this, the appropriate way to treat the divine gift of a stranger is also found in Homer. When Odysseus washes up on the shores of the island inhabited by the great Phaeacian people, in Book 6 of the Odyssey, the white-armed Princess Nausicaa encourages her maidens not to be afraid. The man they see before them is not an enemy, she assures them, but a gift from Zeus, a gift who demands their care. This is passage 11 on your handout. Nay, says Nausicaa, this is some hapless wanderer that has come hither. Him we must now tend, for from Zeus are all strangers and beggars, and a gift, dosis, though small, is welcome. Come then, my maidens, give to the stranger food and drink, and bathe him in the river in a spot where there is shelter from the wind. When Socrates calls himself a gift the god gave you, he's invoking just this Homeric tradition of the stranger or beggar, who's not properly a part of the city, who is from outside the city, or in some sense does not belong to its customs and mores, but who, for that very reason, must be tended and cared for by the people, and for whose presence it is appropriate to feel grateful. So Socrates is a gift to the city of Athens. That's the first thing I want to highlight about this passage. But second, let me emphasize the idea that Socrates' strangeness, the way in which he is a stranger, even in his own home, is part of what makes him such a special gift. Socrates' strangeness is, of course, an essential part of the tradition surrounding him. When Alcibiades describes his love for Socrates in the Symposium, perhaps the most striking thing about it is how the mesmerizing eroticism of Socrates coincides with, perhaps even follows from, his lack of any kind of beauty understood in the traditional way. What's appealing about Socrates, on Alcibiades' account, is that you can never quite figure out what's appealing about him. And this makes his appeal all the more irresistible. With respect to his intellectual beauty in particular, we must remember that Socrates advocates no doctrine that could be learned, reproduced, and handed on. His appeal is found instead in the midst of one's interaction with him. His appeal is the appeal of a genuine teacher. Spreading throughout the city of Athens, one imagines, there must have been rumors of a hidden king. Socrates' strangeness and the kind of teacher he thereby is becomes clearer when compared with the traditional teaching, quote-unquote teaching, of the sophists. Unlike them, Socrates does not give eloquent, artfully constructed speeches. Indeed, there are no independent standards or rules of rhetoric by means of which to measure the beauty of his speech. Instead, he leads you in a joint exploration of some philosophical topic of deep and abiding concern, and he leads you, this is what's most striking to me, mostly by pointing out what not to say. Like Bert standing before his classroom in puzzlement, Socrates leads by negation. But far from indicating that Socrates knows nothing, as Kierkegaard insists, this negative understanding, I think, is the key to what Socrates positively has to offer. It's the key to understanding Socrates as a gift from the gods. For although it's true to say that Socrates has no doctrine, no system, no clear account of what is, it's nevertheless misleading to say that Socrates knows nothing. That would follow only if we presuppose that knowing or understanding is always having a clear and systematic account of the domain you know. What Socrates knows, in fact, is not an object or a concept about which one could theorize, but it's not nothing either. To borrow Heidegger's strange way of talking, it's not that there's nothing Socrates knows. Rather, Socrates knows the nothing, and he knows it in a positive way. So, this is the third feature of Socrates that I would like to highlight, that Socrates, in this puzzling phrase, knows the nothing. But what does this puzzling phrase mean? We can explore it, I think, if we look at the one clear connection that Socrates has with divinity, and that's through his daimon. Recall that Socrates has a daimon, a little divinity or god associated particularly with him, and that this daimon operates in a peculiar way. It only ever tells him what not to do or say. Socrates knows his way around the world, therefore, not by knowing what is, and thereby what is in conflict with it, but by knowing immediately and directly what is not. He knows in the first instance what to avoid, what not to commit himself to, what not to say. Now, Socrates insists that he really does know these things. In fact, he says, the one thing I know is that I don't know. But now we must be using the word know in a very strange way. The source of Socrates' knowledge, after all, is the daimon that tells him no. It is as if Socrates' understanding of the terrain he's navigating comes by way of a divinely given negation. I think we can understand this phenomenon if we recognize, as Heidegger insists we must, that there's a kind of knowledge that guides us in our activity that's not theoretical knowledge of the domain in question. Heidegger says this most clearly when he talks about the ready-to-hand mode of being, about which Bert has taught us so much. The point of equipment when it's in the ready-to-hand mode of being is precisely that it guides us in its use, but it must withdraw from our notice in order to do so. As Heidegger says, this is number 12 on your handout, if we look at things just theoretically, we can get along without understanding readiness to hand. But when we deal with them by using them and manipulating them, this activity is not a blind one. It has its own kind of sight, which is not theoretical sight, by which our manipulation is guided. So Socrates' negative knowledge, I want to suggest, is like this, but with a twist. The guidance the daimon gives him is indeed a kind of sight that's not just theoretical, but what's revealed by it is not how to hammer, but how not to go on. It's an understanding of what is absent, what is not a thing, the nothing. And because it's so distinct from the kind of theoretical knowledge of a domain with which we are all familiar, Socrates can only characterize this understanding as divine. It's fascinating to me how closely this aligns with Bert's way of teaching and being. Bert once told me that from a very young age his father described him as an againster. Remember that? He's not the kind of person, he said, who builds theories or systems, but he does know when the systems or theories that have been built must be resisted or overturned. Like Socrates, Bert knows when to stand up and say no. This has been clear throughout his career, as, for example, when he stood up and said no to the dominant paradigm of good old-fashioned AI at MIT. And like Socrates, Bert knows that one must resist, one must say no, though his knowledge of this is not of any traditional sort. This kind of negative knowledge was always the most fascinating thing to me about Bert when I first met him. You would say something, make a suggestion, offer a reading of a passage, and more often than not he would say, no. Sometimes he could explain why it was appropriate to say no, but often he would just squint his eyes, put his hand to his head and say, it just doesn't feel right. And that was always an invitation to follow up, to explore, and sometimes things would later get clearer. But the initial entry into the phenomenon, the basic and fundamental way of understanding it, was not by knowing what it is, but by knowing what it's not. A good student came, through long exposure, to trust Bert's intuition on these issues as if it were divinely inspired. This kind of understanding by negation is indeed the key, I believe, to ferreting out the phenomenon of Socrates as teacher, Socrates as gadfly, and of course the phenomenon of Socrates as Bert. So, in conclusion, I want to turn briefly to the notion of a gadfly itself. The Greek word muops, gadfly, is a substantive form of the participle that means closing or contracting the eyes as short-sighted people do. It's made up of the verb muo, to close, or be shut, and the noun ops, eyes. The participle can refer to the activity of closing or contracting the eyes, as short-sighted people do, or it can refer to the short-sighted people themselves. So strangely, to be a gadfly in the literal and therefore primary sense of the term is literally to be short-sighted. That is to say, not to have a clear vision of things. What's interesting about this to me is the way in which it stands in contrast with the typical aim of Platonic philosophy, to get the clearest account possible of everything that really is, to get a rational intuition of the forms. As Heidegger insists from the start, This aim is based on the unexamined assumption that what is must be what can be clearly and theoretically described. But Socrates, the short-sighted one, the gadfly, cannot see clearly in this sense. He cannot give a systematic theoretical account of what is. Even so, he's not completely blind. He sees what must be avoided, and most importantly, this is itself a kind of sight. Short sight, the sight of the squinty one. Beyond this literal meaning of the term, the word muops has a metaphorical meaning too, and that's how it comes to mean gadfly in the more traditional sense. The insect that stings the horse and rouses him from his slumber. In particular, the word can be used to mean, of persons or animals, shut the eyes, especially when one shuts one's eyes as a preliminary to going through what is painful. The person about to be stung by a gadfly, in other words, looks the way a short-sighted person looks, with his eyes squinted together in preparation for the sting. Moreover, and this I think is a crucial part of the metaphor, to be prepared in this way to undergo the experience of being stung is to be in a situation not unlike that of the short-sighted gadfly himself. The stingee, the student, shuts his eyes in preparation for the pain that's about to occur without having a clear vision of what exactly that is. He knows, although it's not presently in his experience, of the pain that's about to come. He's directed in this way towards what is not. This, I think, is the true exhilaration of learning with Bert. Like Socrates, he somehow miraculously knows where to resist, where to take his stand. He knows precisely what one must not say. In the most basic cases, it's a mystery where this negative understanding comes from. But it is a spur, a goad. It arouses one to action. And experiencing it is so different from other kinds of learning experiences that the most one can do is to develop a sense for when it's likely to happen. When he's likely to say, no, that doesn't feel right. But developing this sense, developing the experience of Bert's negation as a kind of conscience that speaks in your head, just is developing the kind of experience of negation that he manifests. After prolonged exposure, in other words, one gets something of the sense for when he will feel he has to say no. And through this, one begins to feel that one must say no as well. One transitions in this way from being the person who can feel that the pain or awkwardness of this strange encounter is about to happen to the person who knows his way around this negative terrain. This is a transition in the way one sees the world, and thereby a transition, literally, in one's understanding of oneself. And what a human kind of transition this is. It's precisely the kind of transition that Heidegger describes, I think, in his phenomenological account of being. It sensitizes one to the structures of existence that operate primarily through withdrawing and negation. In this way, Bert's teaching, like Socrates' teaching, changes one's entire understanding of everything that is. If this is not the full kind of Christian rebirth, a negation of the self in order to stand on the ground of God, it is perhaps something better because more human. It is a transition that brings together teacher and student in a shared understanding of what is. And it is precisely the kind that a teacher, a true human teacher, like Socrates, like Bert, can bring about. We can only stand in gratitude before him. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks above all to Bert. And I think that's the appropriate way to end this. Another round of applause and gratitude.